Some places do not wait for you to find them. They wait until you are ready to listen. The rain begins long before Caleb Morgan reaches the old logging road deep inside the Oregon wilderness. Heavy gray clouds swallow the afternoon sun, turning the towering Douglas firs into silent shadows stretching across the soaked forest floor. Water drips steadily from moss-covered branches, carrying the scent of wet cedar, rich earth, and fresh pine through the cold mountain air. Caleb pulls the collar of his weatherproof jacket a little higher and adjusts the worn backpack resting against his shoulders. At 39 years old, the former United States Marine has learned that storms do not care about plans. They only ask whether a person knows how to adapt. Walking several yards ahead, Bruno moves with calm confidence, his black and tan coat darkened by the rain, but his posture never losing its quiet discipline. The German Shepherd does not rush. He does not wander. Every few moments he pauses just long enough to study the forest before continuing forward, as though he already understands a path invisible to everyone else. Caleb planned to spend the next several days building a modest underground shelter in this remote valley, far from crowded highways and endless conversations he no longer wished to have. He wanted a place where silence felt honest, a place where memories could exist without constantly demanding answers. Ever since losing his younger brother during a brutal winter accident several years earlier, the world had become louder than he could bear. Friends offered sympathy. Strangers offered advice. None of it filled the empty space left behind. Only Bruno stayed beside him without asking questions. The rain grows heavier, striking leaves with a steady rhythm that almost drowns out every other sound. Then, without warning, Bruno stops. Caleb notices immediately because the dog never freezes without reason. About 30 feet ahead, a massive cedar tree lies stretched across the hillside, its enormous root system ripped from the earth during what must have been a recent storm. Thick roots twist into the air like giant wooden fingers, carrying clumps of dark soil still clinging to them. The fallen trunk forms a natural wall nearly 12 feet high, its exposed roots creating deep shadows beneath the tangled mass. Caleb studies the tree with practical eyes. It offers protection from wind, natural camouflage, and stable drainage if the surrounding ground proves solid enough. It is exactly the kind of location an experienced outdoorsman would notice. Yet Bruno does not move toward the sheltering trunk. Instead, he slowly approaches the exposed roots and stands perfectly still. His ears lift. His breathing becomes slower. He stares into the darkness beneath the giant tree without making a sound. Caleb walks beside him and kneels carefully, expecting to find a wounded animal or perhaps the entrance to a small burrow. There is nothing visible except damp earth and tangled roots disappearing into blackness. He reaches out to gently touch Bruno's shoulder. The German Shepherd does not look away. Seconds pass. The forest becomes strangely quiet. Even the birds seem to have vanished with the rain. Then Caleb hears it. 3 slow knocks rise from somewhere beneath the earth. Knock. Silence. Knock. Silence. Knock. Neither loud nor violent. Only deliberate enough to make the cold air suddenly feel much heavier than the falling rain. Caleb Morgan remained motionless, listening as the final hollow knock faded into the steady rhythm of falling rain. He did not immediately search for another explanation because years of military training had taught him that reacting too quickly often meant overlooking the truth. Bruno still faced the tangled roots without shifting so much as an inch. The German Shepherd's ears stayed forward, his muscles relaxed but ready, displaying the same disciplined patience Caleb had seen countless times during search and rescue exercises. Whatever had reached the dog's attention had not frightened him. It had simply demanded his focus. Caleb slowly removed a compact flashlight from his backpack and directed the narrow beam beneath the enormous root system. Moist soil glistened against thick roots twisted together like the ribs of an ancient ship buried beneath the forest floor. Small stones reflected the light. Ferns trembled beneath drops of rain. Nothing moved. Nothing answered. Yet the silence itself felt unusually heavy, as though the hillside were holding its breath. Caleb stepped closer, carefully testing each patch of ground before placing his full weight upon it. Recent storms often loosened soil around uprooted trees, creating hidden voids capable of collapsing without warning. He had no intention of becoming careless simply because curiosity had taken hold. Bruno quietly circled the exposed roots once before returning to the exact place where he had first stopped. Again he lowered his head, inhaled deeply, then looked back at Caleb without making a sound. That single glance carried complete trust. Caleb understood it immediately. Bruno was not asking permission. He was sharing information. Caleb knelt beside him and brushed away several inches of soaked leaves and loose dirt with a gloved hand. Beneath the surface, the soil appeared unusually compact, interrupted by a faint circular outline almost hidden beneath layers of mud. It was too symmetrical to be natural. He carefully cleared another few inches until a narrow ring of weathered steel emerged from the earth, heavily stained with rust but still intact. The metal had been buried long enough for moss to creep across its edges, yet someone had once shaped it with deliberate precision. Caleb gently pulled against the ring. It did not move. He examined the surrounding ground instead, tracing shallow lines disappearing beneath the tangled roots. They resembled drainage channels rather than random erosion. Whoever had worked here understood how water traveled through a hillside. Rain continued dripping through the branches above, carrying the sharp scent of cedar sap mixed with damp earth. Caleb leaned back against the fallen trunk and quietly studied the landscape beyond. He noticed something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Although rainwater flowed freely across the slope, almost none of it collected near the exposed roots. Instead, the water disappeared into narrow gaps beneath the tree as though draining into empty space below. That explained the cold air he had felt moments earlier. There was a cavity beneath the hillside, larger than he had first imagined. His original plan had been to spend several days constructing a modest underground shelter using timber, gravel, and careful excavation. Now he found himself standing above something that already existed. Bruno suddenly lowered his nose toward the steel ring once more before gently pawing the ground exactly 3 times. Not digging, not scratching wildly, simply repeating a deliberate signal. Caleb reached into the mud beside the metal ring and felt something solid resting just beneath the surface. He carefully lifted it free. It was an old brass identification tag attached to a broken leather strap, worn smooth by decades underground. Rain washed across its surface, revealing a faint engraving. Caleb held the flashlight closer until the letters slowly became clear. They were not a company logo or government marking. They were the beginning of a person's name, followed by a date from 32 years earlier. Caleb Morgan turned the weathered brass tag over in his hand, while rainwater slowly washed away decades of packed dirt. Only a few letters remained legible beneath the scratches left by time. The first name had almost disappeared, but the family name could still be read with careful attention. Hayes. Beneath it rested a date from 32 years earlier. Nothing else. No official agency. No address. No explanation. Caleb slipped the tag into the small zippered pocket inside his jacket instead of placing it back into the mud. Years of experience had taught him that forgotten objects often carried stories far heavier than their weight. Bruno remained beside the exposed roots, watching Caleb for only a moment before returning his attention to the same section of ground. The German shepherd gently sniffed the air again, then stepped several feet to the left, stopping near a cluster of moss-covered stones that appeared ordinary until Caleb noticed how evenly they were arranged. Nature rarely built straight lines. He crouched beside them and brushed away wet leaves. Beneath the moss, the rocks formed the edge of a narrow drainage trench leading directly beneath the fallen cedar. Whoever had created it understood mountain runoff remarkably well. Even after hours of heavy rain, the trench continued guiding water away from the hidden space below instead of allowing it to collect around the roots. Caleb quietly admired the craftsmanship. This had not been built in haste. It had been designed to survive seasons of storms without drawing attention. He removed a compact folding shovel from his backpack and began clearing only the loose debris covering the trench, careful not to disturb the surrounding soil any more than necessary. He had abandoned the idea of constructing his own underground shelter, at least for now. Before creating anything new, he needed to understand what already existed beneath his feet. Bruno walked a slow circle around the massive trunk before returning once more to Caleb's side. Again the pattern repeated. The dog paused, looked toward the steel ring buried in the earth, then calmly stepped backward. It was the third time Bruno had created distance instead of moving closer. Caleb recognized the message immediately. The ground deserved respect. He examined the hillside again, paying close attention to subtle changes in the terrain. A faint depression stretched several feet downhill from the exposed roots, almost invisible beneath pine needles and fresh rain. It looked less like erosion and more like settling that had occurred gradually over many years. That suggested an empty space below supporting less weight than solid earth. Caleb slowly tapped the ground ahead with the wooden handle of his shovel. Most of the hillside answered with the dense, dull sound of compact soil. Then one section answered differently. Hollow. He tested it again from another angle. The same muted echo returned beneath the rain. He smiled quietly, not because he had solved the mystery, but because the forest had finally begun answering questions instead of asking them. Without warning, Bruno moved between Caleb and the hollow section, gently pressing his shoulder against Caleb's leg. The German shepherd did not appear frightened. He simply refused to let Caleb take another step forward. Less than 2 seconds later, the ground exactly where Caleb had intended to stand settled several inches with a soft crackling sound. Wet soil slid gently into a narrow opening hidden beneath fallen branches, exposing the corner of what looked unmistakably like a concrete stair. Cold air drifted upward through the gap, carrying the faint scent of dry wood instead of damp earth. Caleb stared into the darkness without speaking. Concrete did not belong this deep in untouched forest. Someone had built these stairs with purpose, then hidden them so carefully that even the giant cedar growing above them had become part of the disguise. Bruno stood quietly beside him, his steady amber eyes fixed on the newly revealed entrance as though he had known it had been waiting there all along. Caleb Morgan remained where he was, allowing the hillside several quiet moments to settle before taking another step. Small streams of rainwater continued slipping into the newly exposed opening without causing further movement. He had learned long ago that patience could be more valuable than courage. Rushing into an unfamiliar structure hidden beneath unstable ground was never an option. Bruno stood beside him with calm confidence, neither barking nor retreating. The German shepherd watched the narrow stairway with the steady concentration that had guided countless successful searches. Caleb unclipped a compact headlamp from his backpack, switched it on, and adjusted the beam until the pale light reached several feet below the surface. For concrete steps disappeared beneath the tangled roots before turning sharply to the right. The walls surrounding them were reinforced with poured concrete that showed only minor cracks despite the passing decades. Someone had invested tremendous effort to build this place correctly. Caleb noticed another detail that deepened the mystery. The concrete remained surprisingly dry. Water flowed around the hidden entrance through carefully designed drainage channels instead of flooding the stairwell. Even after hours of relentless rain, the structure continued protecting itself exactly as its builder had intended. Caleb slowly descended the first step, placing only part of his weight upon it before committing fully. Solid. The second step answered with the same reassuring firmness. Bruno followed one pace behind without making a sound. Cool air drifted upward from below, carrying the faint scent of aged cedar boards, clean stone, and something else that did not belong inside an abandoned shelter. Fresh lamp oil. The smell was weak but unmistakable. Caleb immediately stopped. Lamp oil eventually lost much of its sharp scent after many years. This trace suggested maintenance within a far more recent time than the brass identification tag would imply. He raised one hand, silently signaling Bruno to wait. The German shepherd froze instantly, every muscle relaxed yet attentive. Caleb directed his flashlight farther down the narrow passage until the beam rested upon a heavy steel door built directly into the concrete wall. Thick rust covered most of its surface, but the hinges remained strangely clean. Someone had protected the moving parts with care. Mounted near the handle sat a small circular metal plate almost hidden beneath dried mud. Caleb wiped it gently with his glove. The same simple symbol engraved upon the brass tag appeared once again, worn but unmistakable. It was not a government seal or military insignia. It looked more like a handmade emblem created by someone who expected only a few people to recognize it. Caleb reached toward the handle but paused before touching it. Instead, he carefully examined the frame, searching for signs of structural damage or hidden hazards. Everything appeared stable. No loose wiring. No fresh animal tracks. No indication that opening the door would place unnecessary stress upon the aging entrance. Only after completing his inspection did he slowly wrap his hand around the cold steel handle. It resisted for a moment before moving with surprising smoothness. The door opened only a few inches, releasing another slow breath of cool air from the darkness beyond. A warm amber glow suddenly appeared somewhere inside, faint enough to seem almost impossible. Caleb narrowed his eyes, believing at first that his flashlight had reflected against polished metal. Then the glow shifted gently, flickering with the unmistakable rhythm of a living flame. Bruno stepped forward until his nose rested near the narrow opening. He inhaled once, then quietly placed one front paw against the steel door without pushing it farther. Instead of growling or showing alarm, he slowly wagged his tail exactly once. Caleb felt his heartbeat slow rather than race. Whatever waited beyond that doorway did not feel like a threat. It felt like someone had been expecting company for a very long time. Caleb Morgan eased the steel door open another few inches, allowing the warm amber light to spill gently across the concrete floor. It was not bright enough to illuminate the entire chamber, only enough to soften the darkness waiting beyond the entrance. The contrast between the cold rain outside and the quiet warmth drifting from within felt almost unreal. Bruno remained beside Caleb, calm and alert, his ears turning toward every faint sound hidden inside the shelter. Caleb listened carefully. No footsteps, no hurried movement, only the soft crackle of a lantern flame and the distant rhythm of rain tapping against the massive cedar roots overhead. He pushed the door open completely and stepped inside with measured caution. The room was larger than he expected, nearly 20 feet long and perhaps 12 feet wide, reinforced by thick concrete walls that showed remarkable craftsmanship despite their age. Shelves built from cedar planks lined one side of the room. Glass jars filled with neatly organized supplies rested beside carefully folded blankets that appeared protected from moisture. A sturdy wooden table occupied the center of the shelter. Two simple chairs stood opposite one another as though waiting for a conversation interrupted long ago. Against the far wall rested a cast iron stove connected to a narrow ventilation pipe disappearing into the ceiling. Nothing appeared abandoned. Dust covered many surfaces, yet everything remained orderly. Caleb slowly swept his flashlight around the room until the beam reached an old oil lantern resting upon the table. The small flame burning inside explained the warm glow visible from the doorway, but it also created a question with no simple answer. Someone had lit that lantern recently. Oil lamps did not continue burning for years without attention. Caleb approached carefully, extending one hand toward the glass chimney without touching it. Heat still radiated from the metal. The lantern had not merely been burning sometime this week. It had likely been adjusted within the past hour. Bruno quietly walked through the room, sniffing each corner with disciplined precision. Unlike an anxious animal searching wildly for danger, he investigated with quiet confidence, occasionally pausing beside pieces of furniture before continuing. Near the rear wall, he stopped beside a narrow cedar partition built into the shelter. He lowered his head, inhaled once, then looked back at Caleb. There it was again. Not fear, not excitement, simply another invitation to pay attention. Caleb crossed the room and noticed something unusual beside the partition. One ceramic coffee mug rested upside down on a folded cloth, coated with a thin layer of dust. A second mug stood upright beside it. The rim remained perfectly clean. Tiny droplets of fresh water still clung to its outer surface as though it had recently been rinsed. Caleb glanced toward the lantern once more. Two signs of recent activity inside a shelter forgotten by the outside world for more than 3 decades could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. He gently knocked against the cedar partition. The wood answered with a hollow echo rather than the solid sound of a structural wall. There was empty space behind it. Caleb took one slow step closer. Before he could speak, a faint sound drifted through the cedar boards. It was not a voice. It was a soft cough, followed by complete silence. Bruno immediately raised his head and slowly wagged his tail again, exactly once. Caleb felt every instinct sharpen, but not with alarm. The cough carried the unmistakable weakness of someone exhausted rather than threatening. He set his backpack quietly on the floor, keeping his movements slow and respectful. Then, In a calm voice that carried neither fear nor authority, he spoke into the quiet shelter. My name is Caleb Morgan. I am not here to take anything. If someone is inside, you are not alone. Anymore. For several long seconds, nothing answered except the lantern flame dancing gently upon the wooden table. Then, from beyond the cedar partition, an older voice barely louder than a whisper finally reached him. I wondered if someone would find this place before the light went out. Caleb Morgan stepped closer to the cedar partition without haste, allowing the quiet room to settle before moving again. The lantern continued casting a gentle amber glow across the shelter, its light revealing years of careful maintenance instead of neglect. Bruno walked ahead with slow confidence, stopping beside a narrow opening hidden within the wooden wall. The German shepherd sat down calmly, his tail resting against the concrete floor as though greeting an old friend rather than discovering a stranger. Caleb gently pulled the simple latch, and the partition swung inward on well-oiled hinges. Beyond it lay a smaller room no larger than a modest bedroom. A neatly made cot rested against one wall beneath shelves filled with weathered notebooks, folded maps, and labeled storage tins. A portable radio sat silent beside an old pair of reading glasses. Resting against several pillows was an elderly man with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His heavy flannel shirt and wool blanket suggested someone prepared for mountain weather rather than someone hiding from it. His face appeared tired, but his eyes remained clear and steady. He offered a faint smile when Bruno quietly approached and rested his head beside the cot. The old man slowly reached down, his hand gently brushing the German shepherd's neck. "Good dog," he whispered with genuine warmth. Caleb noticed no sign of panic in Bruno's posture. That alone spoke volumes. "I am Caleb Morgan," Caleb repeated softly. "I found the entrance after the storm." The older man nodded as though he had expected exactly those words. "Walter Hayes," he replied after a slow breath. "Forest ranger. Retired many years ago. At least I suppose I still deserve the title." Caleb immediately remembered the brass identification tag resting safely inside his jacket. The family name matched perfectly. He removed the worn tag and placed it gently into Walter's waiting hand. For a long moment, the elderly ranger simply looked at it, his thumb tracing the faded letters while quiet memories passed across his face. "I lost this almost 3 decades ago," Walter said with a gentle smile. "I never imagined it would find its way back before I did." Caleb glanced around the room, noticing shelves stocked with canned food, clean drinking water, first aid supplies, extra lantern oil, and carefully stacked firewood. Everything had been arranged with remarkable discipline. "You built this place," Caleb said. Walter nodded slowly. "Not for myself. For anyone who might need it. Hikers caught in snowstorms. Families trapped by wildfires. Lost children. Anyone who needed one more chance to get home." His eyes wandered toward the concrete ceiling above them. Most people never knew it existed. That was always the point. Caleb understood immediately. The hidden shelter had never been a secret born from fear. It had been built from quiet kindness. Walter explained that every few months he still visited to inspect the drainage system, refill supplies, and keep the ventilation working. Earlier that morning, he had returned after hearing about severe weather moving through the valley. While checking one of the outer drainage channels, the enormous cedar had finally surrendered to years of wind and rain, falling across the entrance before he could leave. The shelter itself remained secure, but the stairway had become completely hidden beneath roots and earth. Walter had enough supplies to wait several days, yet he feared no one would ever discover the buried entrance. Caleb smiled gently. "You forgot one thing." Walter raised an eyebrow. Caleb looked down at Bruno, who quietly rested beside the cot with peaceful eyes. "You did not plan for a dog who listens to the ground better than any person ever could." Walter chuckled softly, the sound filling the little room with unexpected warmth. Then his smile faded into quiet wonder as he studied Bruno once more. "There is something else," he said carefully. "When I first saw him through the crack in the partition, I thought I was remembering someone from a very long time ago. Hey, young boy came here once with a German shepherd that looked almost exactly like him. That boy carried your family name." Caleb Morgan did not answer immediately. The words settled over the quiet shelter with the same gentle weight as the rain above them. He had spent years believing that every chapter connected to his younger brother had already been written. Yet here, beneath the roots of an ancient cedar, Another page had quietly survived. Walter Hayes reached toward the shelf beside his cot and carefully lifted a weathered notebook bound in faded green canvas. The edges of its pages had yellowed with age, but every corner remained neatly protected. He opened it slowly, turning several pages before stopping at a folded sheet tucked carefully inside. "Your brother was about 14 when I first met him," Walter said. "He wandered farther into these woods than he intended during a summer camping trip. He was never truly lost. He was simply curious enough to keep walking." Caleb accepted the folded paper with steady hands. The pencil sketch inside immediately caught his attention. It showed the outline of the hidden shelter, complete with drainage trenches, storage shelves, and a larger ventilation system that had never been built. In the lower corner rested a familiar signature. Daniel Morgan. Caleb quietly smiled despite the tightness in his chest. He recognized the handwriting instantly. Daniel had always filled notebooks with drawings, ideas, and impossible projects. Walter continued speaking, his voice soft enough to match the peaceful glow of the lantern. He asked more questions than any young person I had ever met. He wanted to know why someone would spend years building a place that almost nobody would ever see. Walter paused before looking directly into Caleb's eyes. "I told him that the strongest shelters are not built for the people who make them. They are built for strangers whose names we may never know." Caleb lowered his eyes toward the sketch. Along one margin, Daniel had written a single sentence in careful block letters. "Someday I want to come back and help finish this." The words were simple, but they carried the quiet certainty only young hearts possess. Caleb remembered hearing his brother speak about a retired ranger after one camping trip decades earlier. At the time, it had sounded like another ordinary adventure. Neither of them could have imagined how deeply that brief meeting would shape Daniel's dreams. Walter gently unfolded another sheet of paper, this one containing careful notes about improvements that had never been completed. Additional storage, better drainage, stronger roof supports, emergency blankets for families with children. Every unfinished idea matched the same vision Daniel had sketched years before. Bruno rested peacefully beside the cot, lifting his head only when Walter slowly reached down to stroke the thick fur behind his ears. "Your dog reminds me of the shepherd that traveled with Daniel," Walter said with a warm smile. Different dog, same steady eyes. They both knew how to trust people worth finding. Caleb looked around the hidden shelter once more. Until this afternoon, he had imagined building an underground refuge as a way to disappear from painful memories. Now every wall around him carried a different meaning. This place had never been about hiding. It had always been about remaining ready when someone else needed hope. Outside, the rain gradually softened into a gentle whisper drifting through the towering trees. Caleb folded Daniel's drawing with great care and placed it inside his jacket beside Walter's recovered brass identification tag. Two forgotten pieces of the past now rested together. Before either man spoke again, a distant mechanical sound drifted faintly through the ventilation pipe above them. Caleb recognized it immediately. An engine was climbing the old logging road somewhere beyond the storm, drawing steadily closer to the hidden valley. Caleb Morgan listened until the distant engine became impossible to mistake. It was climbing slowly along the abandoned logging road, its sound rising and falling as tires crossed washed-out ruts hidden beneath the rain. Walter Hayes smiled with quiet relief before leaning back against the pillows. "That will be the county forestry crew," he said. "I left a maintenance schedule with the ranger station. Every season, when I did not return before the storm, someone eventually noticed." Caleb nodded, grateful that help was already finding its way toward the valley. Still, he looked around the shelter with new eyes, understanding that its future mattered far beyond a single rescue. This place represented decades of careful work, quiet compassion, and promises that had survived longer than many buildings above ground. Bruno stood and calmly walked toward the storage shelves, stopping beside a stack of cedar boards resting against the wall. Caleb followed his gaze and noticed several bundles of neatly labeled materials waiting for projects that had never been completed. Pressure-treated support beams, galvanized brackets, sealed containers of hardware, rolls of weather-resistant insulation, and detailed handwritten plans lay arranged with remarkable precision. Walter noticed Caleb studying them and smiled. "I always believed I would finish the upgrades next spring," he said softly. Then another spring arrived, and there was always someone else who needed help first. Caleb unfolded Daniel Morgan's sketch once more, comparing the youthful drawing with Walter's unfinished plans. The similarities were impossible to ignore. The improved drainage channels, expanded storage, reinforced ceiling braces, and emergency sleeping platforms all appeared on both pages. Daniel had not imagined those ideas alone. He had listened carefully, then carried the dream with him long after leaving the forest. Caleb felt the familiar ache of missing his brother, but for the first time in years the memory no longer carried only sadness. It carried direction. He folded the papers carefully and looked at Walter. "When the road is cleared and you are safely home," he said, "I would like to come back." Walter tilted his head slightly. "To build the shelter you originally planned?" Caleb slowly shook his head. "No. That man walked into this forest yesterday. He is gone now." He looked around the warm room illuminated by the steady lantern. "I want to finish this one instead." Silence filled the shelter, but it no longer felt lonely. It felt complete. Walter's eyes became bright with quiet gratitude. "Then Daniel will finally keep his promise," he whispered. Caleb smiled gently. "Both of us will." Several hours later, after the rain eased into a soft mountain mist, the sound of approaching vehicles stopped near the fallen cedar. Calm voices echoed faintly through the entrance as forestry workers carefully cleared enough debris to reach the hidden stairway. Walter greeted them with the easy familiarity of old friendships, assuring everyone that he was comfortable and uninjured. The crew expressed amazement at finding the forgotten shelter still standing beneath the massive tree, and even greater amazement that it had remained fully functional after so many years. Before leaving, Caleb quietly walked back inside one final time. He adjusted the lantern wick until the flame burned with a clean, steady glow. He checked the ventilation pipe, inspected the drainage trench outside the entrance, and carefully measured several support beams with his eyes, already planning the work ahead. Bruno waited patiently near the doorway, watching every movement with quiet satisfaction. Caleb gently fastened Walter's recovered brass identification tag beside the entrance on a newly cleaned wooden beam where it would remain protected instead of forgotten beneath the soil. It no longer marked the past. It marked the beginning of something waiting to be completed. As Caleb stepped back into the cool evening air, the clouds finally opened, revealing a narrow ribbon of golden light stretching across the forest canopy. He realized that he had not come to the mountains to disappear from the world. He had come to discover the place where his brother's unfinished kindness had been waiting for him all along. 6 months later, the hidden shelter beneath the great cedar had become something entirely different from the lonely refuge Caleb Morgan first discovered on that rain-soaked afternoon. Every improvement had been completed with quiet respect for the man who built it and the young dreamer who had once promised to return. Reinforced ceiling braces supported the aging structure without changing its character. Fresh cedar shelves held carefully labeled emergency supplies. A new ventilation system carried clean mountain air through the shelter while preserving the warmth that had always welcomed those who entered. Additional sleeping platforms lined one wall, each prepared with folded blankets sealed inside waterproof containers. Outside, the drainage channels guided every spring rain safely around the entrance, just as Walter Hayes had always intended. Caleb never placed his own name anywhere inside the shelter. The only marker beside the entrance remained Walter's restored brass identification tag, polished but unchanged, resting beneath a simple wooden carving that read, "Shelter for those who need one more chance." Walter visited whenever his health allowed, sitting quietly beside the lantern while sharing stories with young forest rangers eager to learn why one forgotten place mattered so much. He often smiled when visitors assumed Caleb had built everything from the beginning. Walter always corrected them gently. "He finished what kindness started," he would say before falling silent again. Bruno became as familiar to the valley as the towering evergreens themselves. Hikers recognized the calm German shepherd long before they met Caleb, and children often laughed when Bruno patiently accepted gentle pats before returning to his quiet watch near the entrance. He never wandered far from the cedar. Somehow he always seemed to know when someone was approaching long before footsteps reached the clearing. Early one autumn evening, thick clouds rolled unexpectedly across the mountains while a young family exploring nearby trails searched for shelter from rapidly falling temperatures. Guided only by an old emergency map distributed at the ranger station, They reached the hidden entrance just before darkness settled across the forest. Warm light welcomed them from the lantern burning steadily inside. Dry blankets, clean water, simple food, and a safe place to rest transformed what could have become a frightening night into nothing more than another family story told years later around dinner tables. Before sunrise, they carefully cleaned the room, folded every blanket exactly as they had found it, and left behind only a small handwritten note resting beside the lantern. Later that morning, Caleb and Bruno arrived to inspect the shelter after the storm had passed. Everything remained in perfect order. Caleb picked up the folded piece of paper and slowly opened it. Across the center, written in the uneven handwriting of a young child, were only 8 simple words. "Thank you for leaving the light on for us." Caleb smiled quietly, then slipped the note into the same green notebook where Daniel's sketch had rested for so many years. The 2 pages belonged together now. One carried the hope of a boy who dreamed about helping strangers. The other proved that the dream had reached someone he would never meet. Caleb stepped outside into the cool mountain morning as golden sunlight filtered through the towering trees and settled gently across the fallen cedar. Bruno sat beside him, watching the peaceful valley below without making a sound. Caleb no longer came to the forest to escape grief. He came to protect a promise that had outlived loss itself. Sometimes the strongest foundations are not poured with concrete or shaped from timber. Sometimes they are built quietly inside one human heart, carried faithfully by another, and discovered because one loyal dog stopped beside an old tree and listened to the earth before anyone else did.